Good afternoon and welcome to our first annual Yen Nutrition webinar. It's great to see so many of you here from across the UK and also further afield, so many thanks for taking the time to join us this afternoon. My name's Sarah Kendall. I'm a crop physiologist at ADAS and I'm going to be chairing the meeting this afternoon. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I really just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all the Yen sponsors. Although Yen Nutrition hasn't been sponsored in the same way as some of the other networks are, we really recognise that the Yen and consequently Yen Nutrition wouldn't exist without the sponsors. So we're really grateful to all the Yen sponsors. Next slide, please, Roger. So I've just got to go through a few housekeeping points before we can get down to the interesting stuff. So unfortunately, we can't see or hear you today, but hopefully you can see all of us and hear us okay. We are recording this webinar, so if you need to leave or if you want to refer back to something, a link to the recording should be available on the Yen Nutrition webpage on the Yen website within the next few days. We'd really encourage you to tweet about what you hear today and any thoughts that you have, and if you do so, please use the @ADASYen handle. We've got basis and Naroso points available for the meeting, so if you would like basis and Naroso points, please put your account number and your postcode into the questions box and we will then be able to assign those points to you. And finally, if you have any questions, hopefully you can all find the questions box. I just wanted to say as well, though, that please don't feel you can only use that for questions. We really want your feedback, your comments and any thoughts that you've got. And so if you pop them in there, we will make sure that we see them and it will hopefully feed into the good discussion that we're going to have. If we can move on to the agenda, please, Roger. So I'm joined today, you can see them all here, by my colleagues, so Dhaval Patel, who is the Yen manager, Roger Sylvester-Bradley and Daniel Kindred. And we've created an agenda where we've tried to keep things fairly flexible because we want to allow plenty of time for discussion. So we're planning for this meeting to last until at least 5 o'clock. And hopefully there will be lots of questions and comments and enough to keep us going until 5:30 at the latest. So I'm going to start by giving a quick introduction to Yen Nutrition and then I'll hand over to Roger, who is going to talk us through an annual review of the results from 2020. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time for some Q&A then. And then we're going to move on to Daniel, who will talk us through dynamic benchmarking, and we'll kind of wrap up with more discussion at the end. Before we get started, I just want to kind of reiterate that we're having this meeting because we want it to be an opportunity for us all to learn from each other. So it's a co-learning exercise. And as I already mentioned, and for that reason, we really welcome any comments and feedback that you've got. So all your thoughts are really valued. So please put those in the questions box so we can address them. Okay. If we move on, Roger, so we're going to start just with a couple of polls. It's useful to give us a bit of background as to who's actually listening today. So Jane, if you could launch the first poll. So the first question is, are you a grower, agronomist, industry rep or a researcher? Okay, so if we can see the answers, please, Jane. Okay, so almost half are growers. We've got a good proportion of agronomists here today, and also some researchers and others from the industry. So that's really great to have a good spread of people. Okay, if we can have the next poll, please, Jane. So we're also interested to know, were you involved in Yen Nutrition last season? Okay, and if we can have a look at the results, please. Okay, so that's interesting. Around half of you were involved and half not. And I think that's really good because, you know, we really want to take on board feedback from those that have been involved, but this is also an opportunity to really give an insight into what's involved thinking forward to this harvest. And then the final poll at this point, please, Jane. So we're also really interested to know from a crop monitoring perspective what you're basing decisions on, or if you were to make decisions, what you would base them on. So which of the following statements best applies to your crop nutrition monitoring strategy? So I use a range of methods, soil, tissue and grain. I generally rely on soil analyses only. I use regular soil analyses and some tissue testing. I use regular soil analyses and some grain analyses. And then finally, if you have an other strategy. Just wait a couple of seconds for everyone to vote. Okay, if you'd like to show the results, Jane. Okay, so around 40% of you are using all three methods, which is really interesting. And I can see that actually only around a fifth or less than a fifth are just using soil analysis on its own. Okay, thanks for those, Jane. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please, Roger. So I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction really into Yen Nutrition and what it's all about and where really it's come from. So the first Yen was started in 2013 with this principal aim of finding and supporting arable innovators. And this has really taken place by benchmarking the best farm crops for yield and many other explanatory metrics. In 2016, we added grain analysis into these many metrics that were being measured. And after 8 seasons of the Yen, one of the real key conclusions that has come out is that although yield variation shows a lot of unpredictability, yields do differ consistently and significantly between farms. And so one of the possible reasons for this is that efficacy of crop nutrient management may also differ consistently and significantly between farms. And really we see the routine nutritional post-mortem as a discovery of Yen, where the value and initial adoption was first seen. And so for that reason and on the basis of that discovery, we launched Yen Nutrition in 2020. And the ambition of Yen Nutrition was to maximise the number of fields where nutritional post-mortems were carried out, and then to maximise the learnings that can be obtained through sharing this data. So in the broader network, members are generally entering fields, a larger number of fields, so up to 6 fields, and providing crop husbandry information, their growing conditions and yields. So really what we're trying to do is to improve the monitoring of crop nutrition. So we're used to thinking about analysing soils every 3 to 5 years for pH, P, K and magnesium. And we can analyse all 12 of the nutrients through leaf analysis to try and determine through the season if the crop is running low. But really, we've only just realised that we can actually analyse the crop at harvest, and we can use this analysis as a post-mortem to try and understand whether we got crop nutrition right or not across all 12 nutrients. If we can move to the next slide, Roger, please. So I just want to try and summarise the reporting, because this is a really crucial part of Yield Nutrition in providing back data and information to those that have been involved. So the first report that is sent is what we call an offtake report, which is as soon as the grain samples are analysed and the field yields have been provided. The second report is the benchmarking report, and this is when most of the grain samples have been analysed. And you can see here that we provide the information back through these box and whisker plots, and also through these diagrams that we're calling target diagrams. Thirdly, there's a season summary for all members when most of the data has been analysed and interpreted. And then finally, and this is really going to be the focus of what Roger is going to talk about this afternoon, is the annual review, which really summarises the data and the statistical analyses that have gone on to provide the messages in the season summary. So I'm going to hand over now to Roger, who's really going to provide a lot of detail and information about what we've learned so far from Yield Nutrition. And as I mentioned, please do put your questions, comments, feedback into the questions box so we can address that a little later. Okay, over to you, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And good afternoon, or whatever time of day it is for you, everyone. Really good to have this opportunity. And as Sarah's very nicely explained, this is the first of what we trust will be an annual meeting where we can discuss the success of crop nutrition across the industry. And it's really, to me, it's a really exciting thing to happen quite at the end of my career, that we've discovered, I've been working on nutrition and productivity of crops all my life, and it's the first time we've realized we can actually assess the success of nutrition if we just analyze the grain at harvest. And it's astonishing to me that, as far as I can see, nowhere in the world has realized that this is a sensible way of operating. We sort of get taught that crops have a fairly standard content of nutrients per ton, and that we take that into account when we judge our fertilizer applications. But the experience in the yen is there is a lot of variation out there. And so it's my job today to briefly introduce what you as entrants, the half of you who have been involved in Yield Nutrition, what you've been receiving and how we expect you've been using that information. But really the value and the learning that we'll move forward with comes from collecting all the data together and analyzing all the data and seeing what patterns there are in the data and what explanations there are for those patterns. So that's my job as a scientist, is to try and help you understand those things. So far, you've received basically the headlines from that process. In March, you received these 4 pages, which provided whatever it was, sort of a dozen headlines from the analysis of all the data. But what my job today is to go through the background, how we came up with those headlines, the sort of evidence that and the way we're thinking, and then to hopefully, I mean, it's not very easy with this virtual system of having a discussion, but we would love your questions and your ideas of what we should look for in the database. What we've decided to do, both the 4 pages that have been provided to members and the 30-page report that provides the backup for that, we've decided to make it freely available via our website or via emailing Dhaval at adus.co.uk. You can ask to have this report, and we would really like the feedback about the report. So the condition of you having the report is that you provide us with some feedback of what you thought of the report and how we could improve it into the future, because we want this to be a really useful document for the industry going forward. So to start the review, I just thought I'd put 2020, which for many reasons was an awful year, put it into context as far as crop nutrition is concerned. And this evidence comes from the cereal yen. So the cereal yen, we've been collecting evidence for 4 or 5 years now. I've got 4 of the years here. The first year was quite variable, but what you see here is that there is some seasonal variation in nutrient contents of wheat grain year on year, but it's not huge. So it's understandable why we've come to the sort of assumption that the variation isn't huge. But and in 2020, you know, we can see that nitrogen and sulfur were roughly in keeping with the previous years. Phosphorus was a bit low, potassium was a bit high, magnesium is quite variable, manganese, it was particularly low this year. So you'll see that coming through as I go through the different nutrients. But the database that we're now looking at comes from about, well, we started doing the analysis in November. So, and it's been quite an effort. So we've just restricted the analysis to the 129 farms and the 701 fields of evidence that was provided by that point. But since then, we've had a few more, which will feed into next year's review. So what can we make of this number of data? Well, it's really rewarding to have so many entries in our very first year, and so we've got 300 yields, which is more than we've had in any year from the cereal yen, 300 wheat fields and 200 barley fields, and we've got a few fields of oats and oilseed rape and field beans and various other crops. But so the most I can be able to say, that, I mean, the name of the game in analyzing big data sets is in having lots of data. The more data we have, the more sophisticated we can make our explanations, our analyses and our learnings. So that's really the theme of this whole webinar, is to show you the potential power of sharing data in this way and making learnings out of it. But you can't expect too much from 1 year and only a couple of hundred fields of wheat and a couple of hundred of barley. Okay, I mean, in fact, the people who provided the samples, and they also provided, of course, their yields. They provided really good information about the location, the soil analysis, the previous crop, the variety of the crop they grew, and the fertilizers and manures they applied. So in fact, overall, our database just from last year is of the order of 27,000 bits of data. So there's a lot to pore over. You can see why it's taken since November. And really the conclusion that we sort of, the headline of all this is we're seeing enormous variation between fields across the UK. It's mainly the UK for yen nutrition. We've had 1 or 2 from overseas, and we're very interested in collaborating with organizations overseas. So if you're interested, please tell us. But most of this is within the UK. The cereal yields varied last year of these 710 fields from 1 to 13 tons per hectare. So huge variation. I'm going to not focus on the yield variation. We do have a chapter on that in the book, in the review. I'm going to mainly talk about the nutritional concentrations of the nutrients in the grain, because those also varied a lot. So this is an example of what we call our benchmarking diagram, or as Sarah said, our box and whisker diagram, that shows the full range. In this case, it's a crop of wheat being compared with 211 other wheat crops, well, 210 other wheat crops, and their protein concentrations varied from 9% up to 16%, and the middle values were between 11.5% and 13%, and the middle value was of the order of 12%. And the particular example I've selected had a protein concentration of almost 15%. So immediately this grower can see, by comparing his own value with everybody else's, whether he was high for this year in particular, and whether, and as benchmarking improves in its sophistication, as Dan will explain later, you'll be able to compare with the same variety or the same region or whatever it is. But at the moment, we can just do it with the data set as a whole. But the other information in this diagram is the red dotted line between the yellow area and the green area. And the red dotted line, we've produced one for each of the 12 nutrients, but actually the evidence behind that line is not the same for each of the 12 nutrients. So we have good information for 4 of them, modest information for another 4, and really no information for the final 4. So for where we don't have good information, we've just taken the lower quartile from the previous yen evidence that we have from the UK. But now what I want to show you is the page of benchmarking diagrams that Yen Nutrition entrants receive. So across the page, from left to right, we have the 6 fields, and down the page, we have the 12 nutrients, going from the macronutrients, the 6 macronutrients at the top, to the micronutrients at the bottom. And the diagram I just showed you was the one in the top left. So what a grower can see by having all the information on just one page, you can look across all your fields to see how they rated for nitrogen nutrition, and immediately you can see that this farm, it has a high level of nitrogen status for all the crops other than field beans, pretty good for phosphorus except for one crop of winter barley, and so on down the page. And then you can look down the column and to see if any particular field, it has any particular sort of general pattern in terms of its fertility and its crop nutrition. So that's what we've been able to provide so far in terms of benchmarking for each entrance. And this benchmarking, comparing yourself against everybody else from the same peer group, if you like, is to us a really powerful, and it's come through the yen learning that growers really appreciate being able to do this. But what I now got to do is to move beyond this to looking across all the farms. So the farm we've just looked at had relatively, apparently it was doing pretty well for nutrition, and that is really what sticks out from analysis of all this data, that the biggest factor affecting the level of nutrition, the concentration of nutrients in your grains, is the farm itself. Farms differ, and they might be adjacent farms, but they differ in the way they manage their nutrition and the way their nutrition relates to the amount of dry matter that they're producing. However, and as Sarah said, we find this also for yields. So yields differ between farms, but actually it isn't necessarily the farms that are generous with nutrition that have high yields and the ones that are stingy that have low yields. It doesn't necessarily work that way, and we've still got to unravel the complexities of how nutrition and yield interrelate. But I can move on and talk further about nutrition. And we've looked for regional patterns amongst the farms, and for some nutrients there does seem to be some sort of regional pattern. For instance, with nitrogen here, so the green blobs are bigger, the bigger the deviation, so the more generous they are, the bigger the blob, and the more stingy they are, the whiter and bigger the blob. So you can see that the apparently generous farms, I mean, we can argue about whether it's generosity or something else, but to me at the moment I'm interpreting as generosity. And you can see that they're congregated mainly on the east of England, whereas in Scotland and in the southwest they're lower. Potassium, there isn't such a regional pattern, and we could go on through the other nutrients, but I don't have time. What I want to do now is to look at how the concentrations of nutrients in all the grains that we've had, the hundreds of cereal grains, 542 in fact, in this particular analysis, how they related to the critical values of the 8 nutrients that we've got some feel for whether the level is deficient or not. And the surprising well, it was surprising when we began doing this in the end, but it really echoes what we found in the end, that in Yen Nutrition last year, only a very small portion of the crops, these 500 odd crops, were not deficient in any nutrient. So nutrition is, deficiencies in nutrition are the norm. And that really says, you know, that we've got a challenge on our hands. So 13% no deficiencies, more than half, more than one deficiency. And the main deficiencies, they've generally been in the yen affecting all the macronutrients and manganese. And generally that's what's happened in this case too. But as I said, this year was a high year for potassium, so we've got fewer deficiencies, and it was a low year for phosphorus, so we've tend to got quite a lot of deficiencies of phosphorus. Nitrogen's fairly similar to previous years, sulfur's very similar to previous years. We've got more manganese deficiencies than in previous seasons. So I'm now going to move through each of the nutrients and try and estimate the importance of each of these nutrients in terms of and the importance of interpreting the value for each farm. So I'm going to start with nitrogen, and what I'm going to do is to compare the values that you got with the values from variety trials. The values in variety trials are very robust. We do 30 trials a year, and we average the results over several years. So we've got a pretty good, and they use fertilizer levels that are actually recommended in the fertilizer recommendations. So we're pretty sure that these protein levels are representative of the genetic variation. So we're taking the genetic variation out, and then we're looking at the deviation. That's the blue line here is the recommended list level, and then we look at the deviation of each of the crops to the left or the right, or to, in other words, less protein or more protein, or less nitrogen in the case of barley, or more nitrogen in the case of barley, that it says in the recommended list. And in RB209 it says that the implications of being deviating from this norm is something of the order of 50 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer nitrogen per hectare per % of protein deviation. So if you've got a 2% deviation, sort of less protein than the recommended list says, then your application probably deviated by about 100 kilograms per hectare of fertilizer nitrogen. So it's a really useful way of interpreting. And if we look at the huge range of deviations that we see in these 542 cereal crops, then we have to conclude that imprecision in nitrogen is quite costly to the industry. In fact, it's the most costly of all the nutrients, probably, as we would expect. So we've got almost a quarter of the fields deviating by more than I've tried to, I mean, this is very much a sort of estimate from what we know about response curves. So we've, on the left of this blue line, we're losing money because we're not achieving optimal yields. On the right, we're losing money because we're spending too much on fertilizer. But that those losses amount to quite sizable sums, so more than £300 per hectare on quarter of the fields. So it's going to be important in Yen Nutrition and generally to interpret what we're to really measure these grain, because of this huge variation, really measure and interpret and react accordingly to learn whether we're over or under fertilizing and try and home in on more optimal strategies. So I'm now going to try and do the same thing for phosphorus. We don't assume that we're losing money if we apply too much phosphorus, because it just builds up the reserves. So I've only got a curve that's going to the left. But what we have in RB209 is a norm of about 6.5 kilograms of phosphate per ton, which is the same as 0.33% phosphorus in the dry matter. Actually, the deficiency threshold for this nutrient is very similar to the RB209 norm. So what we're saying is, on average, the crops have just about got enough. But then if we look at the response that we see, if we have less grain P than this 0.32, this deficiency threshold, then we can look at long-term phosphorus trials to see what the impact is on grain yield. And again, it's quite substantial, as it's not large as we get down to sort of 0.3 or 0.28, but by the time you get down to 0.25 or 0.2, then the losses can get quite big. So again, if we look at the range of phosphate of grain phosphorus that we're seeing in Yield Nutrition, then the majority of crops are actually in the deficient category, and 9% of the fields are actually losing. If we value grain at £200 a tonne, then roughly 10% of the fields are losing more than £300 per hectare as a result of imprecise phosphorus nutrition. So again, what we need to do is to be studying this longer term. Don't react on just 1 year's data, but see what the implications are if we look across fields and across years. Quickly, I'll deal with potash and the other nutrients. So the norm for potash is to have 5.5 kilograms per tonne. We see significant variation. In fact, most of the crops from Yield Nutrition, even though potash was high last year, according to the yen, then the potash in the grain from these crops in 2020 were less than RB209 assumes. So in fact, the saving, if the farmers who have used Yield Nutrition last year have reacted to our offtake reports appropriately, they will have saved £6 per hectare, which straight away has paid for the cost of Yield Nutrition. We have a very uncertain critical threshold for potash for potassium in grain, which is about 0.38, but that's a very rough figure. It comes from overseas evidence. It sort of suggests that actually last year we were all right in terms of potassium deficiency, very few potassium deficient crops. Quickly, the other nutrients, sulfur. Most crops, the sort of average sulfur applied was more than 50 kilograms per hectare. Deficiency criteria, we've sort of lost a bit of confidence in that this year, because if we look at percent sulfur in the grain, it gives us a different answer to looking at the nitrogen sulfur ratios. But both were indicating deficiency on 7% of crops last year. Magnesium, generally the levels of magnesium in soils are reasonably satisfactory, and the amounts of magnesium that are applied are very small, and only 8% of crops were deficient in magnesium. Magnesium was lower in the grain if soils were at a higher pH. The manganese levels were low last year in wheat, and they were particularly low in barley, and this isn't something that I've learned, it's brand new to me. I can't find anything in the literature that says that manganese is definitely generally lower in barley than wheat, but it is as a result of what we've seen this year. So actually 87% of barley crops would be classed as deficient according to our 20 part per million threshold, whereas only 13% of wheat crops were classed as deficient last year. Whether this means barley is tolerant of manganese deficiency, or barley is actually having more manganese deficiency, we don't yet know, and that remains to be explored. Boron, we've got a little bit of information, but we really don't know how to diagnose boron in grain. The very small part of the whole crop's boron is in the grain. Boron was actually lower at higher soil pHs. Molybdenum, there were big species differences between the different crops, which we're learning about. Only 1% of crops were sprayed with molybdenum. People are not worried about molybdenum. More crops were sprayed as terms of micronutrients. Obviously manganese was sprayed a lot, but 16% of crops were also sprayed with copper, but only 1% were deficient. 8% of crops were sprayed with copper, only 1% was deficient. So to summarize, I hope I haven't taken too long. What is the state of arable crop nutrition, would you say, in this country at the moment? I mean, it's had an enormous investment. I've dedicated my career to it. There are all sorts of organizations that attempt to help us interpret what we're seeing in terms of crop nutrition. We have all sorts of companies producing products and evidently successfully providing for the nutrition of our crops. But nevertheless, in talking to a lot of people who I would respect, I still have to say that crop nutrition is in a mess. And this is a word that has been used by a lot of people that I would respect. So, and the reason is, I think, that we can't see what we're doing. So thus far, we've invented rules. We've got standard concentrations in the grain of potash and of phosphate. We've got RB209, which earnestly does a really, the best job we can. All recommendation levels for all crops, for all nutrients. But we haven't had a way of monitoring success. And so, to me, grain analysis is it's a no-brainer. Why didn't we think of this before? That we could just take a cupful of grain from each trailer as we bring it into the store and send it off for analysis. It doesn't cost very much compared with how much we're spending on fertilizer. Why haven't we thought of doing this before? And nobody, as far as I can see, it's not done anywhere in the world. So assessing the success of nutrition, our most expensive input, seems to me, it's something that I'm really energized about, as you can tell at the moment. And there are some nutrients that we can actually diagnose the extent to which we're getting things wrong. So it's a really useful and exciting new tool. We've seen, we've had hundreds of samples submitted in 2020. That has been excellent. But the nutrition of crops is such a complicated a process that we're going to need thousands, tens of thousands of values before we can really start to see and sort of finesse the explanations that we're getting. We know that nutrition, it isn't totally dominating yield variation, but I'm sure it has some role in it, and it apparently, we are losing quite a lot of production as a result of imprecision in nitrogen and phosphorus nutrition. So there are huge challenges ahead, and at the farm scale, I think the answer is to instigate this routine monitoring, comparison, benchmarking, so that we get to understand what is happening field by field. But as far as I'm concerned, and colleagues on this webinar, our job is to try and enable as many people as possible to do this, and thereby to create this knowledge base, this database, and that's what Daniel and Dhaval have been working on, and Daniel's going to explain in a minute. I think we need to know more about the efficacy of our fertilizers. The fertilizers that we use are not routinely tested, and I know from my experience that they're enormously variable in their efficacy, and some of the products that we're using are very poorly efficient. So the very small proportions, I mean, particularly the work we've been doing on phosphorus, the average uptake of triple superphosphate, phosphorus from triple superphosphate was 4% in our experiments. So there's a huge gap in our knowledge about the efficacy of products, and if we can use grain analysis, actually it will tell us about the efficacy of the products we're using. It'll really build that intelligence. I mean, every fertilizer we apply is obviously introducing nutrient into the environment. So we've got to look harder and harder at recycling nutrients, and grain analysis is telling us how much nitrogen we're feeding into the next bit of the food chain, and how that will come round, and how much we'll need to have to try and bring that round so that it's actually feeding our crops rather than being dispersed into the environment. And of course, nitrogen has a big part to play in the carbon footprinting of our crops. So we're very concerned about getting nitrogen nutrition right in order to, if we're ever going to achieve net zero, and we've got some ambitious targets to do that. So I think that's enough from me, and I think it's now, Sarah, time for questions.
It is indeed, and there are lots. Enough to keep us going till 5:30, I would suggest anyway. We'll cover a few now, Roger. So there's a couple of questions that are quite linked. So Jim Carswell has asked, how do you think the kind of current conditions at the moment, what impact will that have on nutrient deficiencies this season? And then I think a little bit linked to that, Thomas Pearson's asked, what effect do you think the drought in 2020 had on the grain nutrition results? We did pilots in 2018 and 2019. Did they show any indication of whether the drought had an effect or not? So I guess questions just generally asking about the weather conditions and the drought and the impact that that's having on uptake and what we've kind of seen so far.
Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, but, I mean, nutrient droughts are a reality, and in fact we're seeing spring droughts so commonly now that I actually believe we should be factoring these into our planning. But and you know, the nutrients, you know, as far as the crop's roots are concerned, the nutrients are held in the topsoil, the water's held primarily in the subsoil. So we're talking about droughts, the nutrient droughts and water droughts being caused by different parts of the soil and different parts of the root system. So what we're seeing at the moment is clearly nutrient drought. If the soil, if the crop hasn't got roots down into the subsoil, then we'll also be seeing water drought. But I'm pretty sure we are seeing nutrient drought, and I've been walking crops where I've seen fertilizers sitting on the surface for days and days, which is very worrying and disappointing. I mean, I have to say that in the experimentation I've done over the years, a delay in uptake, I mean, particularly with nitrogen, the delay in uptake of quite a number of weeks wasn't disastrous in the end, but it, you know, it's not perfect, and it will have knocked the canopy expansion back. It will have held canopy expansion back. Probably we'll be losing tillers that we wouldn't want to lose, and so we won't be able to necessarily make the canopy sizes that we don't otherwise have wanted to do. So I mean, we've been debating irrigation in our group in the last week. We've got an article in our Crop Action magazine, and yeah, I think well, you know, and one of our yen growers did actually do an experiment last year that showed a real benefit from, you know, 2.1 tons per hectare from applying, I think it was 70 millimeters. So a substantial response to irrigation. So if you can irrigate, it would be worth irrigating, but I know very few people can. Do you think that answers it, Sarah?
Definitely part one. I mean, Thomas was kind of asking about, have we been able to see anything in previous grain analysis results where we've had droughts in the spring, but I mean, it's tricky to unpick to that degree.
I mean, that is, you know, there are zillions of questions that we can ask of this growing database, and that will be one of them. We haven't looked at it. I mean, my, you know, long experience, but it's not data driven, is that magnesium is one of the primary nutrients that is affected by nutrient droughts, these spring dry springs. But and possibly, I mean, you know, last year what we saw, we didn't actually see low grain magnesium, we saw low grain manganese and high grain potassium. So I mean, that's not, it's not necessarily would fit with what I might predict. So, you know, it's something we're going to have to learn, I'm afraid.
Yeah. A good question from Jamie McKay was thinking about P deficiency, and he's asked, why are all 11 grain samples deficient in P even on fields that have had heavy sewage sludge cake amendments. And I suspect there's probably many people in potentially similar situations, or may have high P indices in their soil, but their grain analysis is still coming out as showing up deficient.
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid I have to say again, this is still a puzzle for us. We've seen this big range in grain phosphorus, and it doesn't relate to soil phosphorus. There is no significant, in the 2020 data, there is no significant relationship. The only relationship we've got is that soil pH. So the higher the pH, the lower the grain phosphorus. And that is logical. That is what you would expect. You know, the calcium is probably immobilizing some of that sewage sludge P if Jamie's fields are high pH, but which I rather suspect they are. And to be honest, I've spent 10 years working on phosphorus and not seen a good way of sort of just a snap of the fingers curing phosphorus deficiency. I mean, you can do it by building up high soil phosphorus, which is the standard, you know, way RB209 recommends, but it's gloriously inefficient. And we have to really, I think we have to search high and low and really scratch our heads to try and get phosphorus into crops more efficiently than we're doing it at the moment. I mean, you know, there are arguments about doing it in association with ammonium nutrition. If you can reduce the sort of local acidity around the root system to try, so use diammonium phosphate, for example, that may improve the efficiency, but I don't have experimental evidence that that actually works.
Yeah, okay. A good question from David Brightman about that we often refer to the N to S ratio, but can you comment about the ratios between all nutrients and whether or not they're critical, and should we be thinking about not just the results on a per nutrient basis, but yes, on a ratio basis as well?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I mean, we express everything on a per dry matter basis, so they're always ratios what we're dealing with in nutrition. So, but it's per watt, and we always do it on a per dry matter basis. We did actually do a whole exercise with, I think it wasn't with the N 2020 the nutrition data, but it was a year or two earlier, where we expressed each nutrient in relation to each other nutrient. So you can imagine it was a huge exercise, and then looked at the correlations with yield, and nothing was better than expressing the nutrients on a per dry matter basis. So I do wonder whether there's something sort of analytical at the back of that. I don't know, but in other words, yeah, the errors around nutrient determination are greater than the errors around dry matter determination. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but we have looked at that, but it definitely merits looking at again. And there are philosophies that there's a philosophy in South Africa where they do this, as David suggests, which is called DRIS, D-R-I-S.
Okay, I think we'll just do one more for now, and I know there's quite a few questions that Daniel will like to provide his comments on as well, so we can come to those a bit later. So can you just comment on the methods that have been used to analyse the nutrient content, and can you say anything about the accuracy of these methods?
Yeah, so I should have given due recognition to our laboratories, because they've been fantastic in supporting what we're doing. I mean, clearly we pay them for it, but they have worked with us. You know, in the end, they sponsor the EN, and that we're you know, we are very pleased with what they're providing for us. The labs have their own quality assurance systems, and we ask them about that all the time. So and we get good answers. So I don't think, you know, I don't think we've got a problem in terms of variability, but the labs, you know, it's always a challenge getting a good grain analysis. The methods, I mean, the nitrogen is measured by near-infrared reflectance, and the most of the nutrients are measured by inductively coupled plasma. I mean, I'm afraid I'm not a chemist, and I don't understand really what those phrases mean. I do understand a bit more about near-infrared reflectance, but yeah, we'll have to have another webinar with the labs if that sort of question needs a proper answer.
Okay, that's great, Roger. Thanks a lot. And I think at this point, we'll hand over to Daniel, who's going to update us on imminent digital developments for yen nutrition, which is very exciting. Okay, thanks, Dan.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Roger. So as Sarah said, we've been running the yen since 2013, when we started with about 30 cereal growers. But that's now grown into a whole family of yens, where we're across all these different networks, including with yen nutrition, and now going forward yen zero. Roger mentioned about the importance of greenhouse gas emissions going forward. But we're sharing the same approach here, the approach of sharing data, of benchmarking, sharing ideas and communicating and co-learning. And so what we've been looking to do is to develop the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that can support this way of working. And we've just had a first bit of success with some with Innovate in a 6-month project that started in November to help us start that process of developing the digital infrastructure that can really help us with the data exchange, and then also enabling you to visualize the data back that we can use across those yens. We've also another project we're calling Farm Pet, which started in January, which is really taking the approach of the yens and trying to apply that much more broadly. And that again starts with a website that we're starting there, that farmpep.net, that's currently part of the yen website, that will really be about helping communication and providing those connections between all of us and projects and people, and so that we can kind of share those ideas and all the questions that are coming through on the chat now, on the questions now, being able to formalize that and learn knowledge, get knowledge from that. So one of the key things that this project has done, this funding we've had over the last 6 months has enabled us to do, is to put all of the data from all of the yens together. So Roger said that the analysis that he's talked about just now was really done on about 700 data points or 700 fields from 2020 from yen nutrition. What we can now do, well, having put all of the data together from all of the yens, is that we now have a data set with 2,800 yields in it across 10 different crops, and with included in that over 2,500 grain analyses, and across a whole range of other factors, and a total of more than 650,000 data points in total. So the opportunity now, I think, for the kind of for the analysis that we can do next year and going forwards, you know, is really, really exciting. But what we also want to be able to do is to be able to open that up to you, because at the end of the day, all the data that's in here has come from these yen communities over the years. And what we can now start to do is to be able to open that back to you. So that's what we call dynamic benchmarking. So kind of with the box or whisker part kind of graphs that you're familiar with, but giving you some more control over them. So rather than them just being static graphs that you see on a bit of paper, enabling you to actually choose the data that you're looking at. So next slide, Roger. So the way that we're going to do that is through the Yen website. So everything that we've now connected the Yen website with our Yen database, and you are now able to join the Yen website as a user. So there's a new button in the top right hand corner where you can join. You give your name and your email address, and then you'll be able to log in to the Yen and get your own personalized news. So through a dashboard, seeing the news that's relevant to you, will make member-only reports and content available on that. So the Yen Nutrition Annual Review that Roger mentioned, this 30-page document that we have, will be accessible via the website on that basis. And it also allows you to then access this dynamic benchmarking. So you'll be able to access your data since 2013 through the site. So as long as you join with the same email that you've used with the Yen in the past, and then you'll receive a confirmatory email to prove that it's you, then that should provide the link to the data for you to be able to make it work. Only you will be able to see your individual data, so we're keeping it all anonymized, but all of that data forms part of the benchmarking data set. And we're making it so that we're only returning data from benchmarking if there's more than 10 entries, so that helps to protect that anonymity of the data. So next screen. So this is what the dynamic benchmarking at the moment currently looks like. We have these 3 steps. So when you go into the Yen website, you will be able to access these 3 steps. So firstly, you select your field. So if you're been in Yen Nutrition for 1 year, then you might have 6 fields in there. If you've been part of the Yen for the last 5 or 6 years, then you might have several more. So then you'll be able to select the data that you're interested in, up to 6 at a time, just by clicking on the entries. You can then, in step 2, filter your comparison. So at the moment, we're making that's limited to being able to filter by crop, region, soil type, and year. So that defines what shows up in the box and whiskers plot in the background. And so then number 3 here is in the data. So you push the Get Data button on step 2, and then number 3 shows you returns back to you your data. So with each of your fields showing up as a different color for grain yield, for grain nitrogen, grain phosphorus, grain magnesium, and grain manganese. So we kind of focus this on Yen Nutrition as a kind of as a first kind of use case. Our aim ultimately is to be able to make all the metrics that we're currently measuring, that we have in the Yen data available to you like this, and to be able to filter it by any set of characteristics, so that you then can do your own research, if you like, on the full Yen data set, to put you give you the power to explore the data and ask questions, and to exploring those effects of soils and location. So just to go to the next slide, Roger. So this just kind of shows a couple of examples of that from a random couple of fields that I chose. So you go on to number 2. So once you've done this, and you can just toggle on and off the fields, or change the fields from one to another, and then change the filters that you're looking at. So so if you go from looking at all of the data to just choosing a region, the region that you're in, and then your data points will stay the same, but the box and whiskers in the background will change. So you can see that maybe your phosphorus is quite low for all the data, but if you look at just sites within East Anglia, maybe it's not quite so low. And then again, you can do the same for soil type. If you go to the next slide. And it's an and/or, so you can build those two things together, as long as there's enough data in the data set to be able to return, to be able to look at more than 10 entries. So we're really quite excited about this, about kind of being able to make this available to, and and being able to return back to you the data that you as a young community has kind of have shared with us over the last 8 years. We're now got this, like I say, it's linked to the website, and it's now sort of in testing mode. So if you think you'd like to have a go with this, then let us know, and we can set that up for you so that you can see your results, and you can be a test user for us. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So the idea is that this will be available to everybody for Yen Nutrition samples or entries that we have from this year, from 2021. And so that registration, so that being able to enter Yen Nutrition 2021 will be available soon. And again, that will all be through the website. So you will log into the website before you can do anything else, so that we know who you are. And that's what Dhaval, as the Yen manager, is in charge of that, and will be the person who takes the money off you. So Dhaval, do you want to go through a bit more of the process?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. Hopefully we will be able to save everyone some money. So thank you, Dan. That's a really exciting addition to our new Yen website, and I really hope that for Yen Nutrition from this year, we will be able to provide dynamic benchmarking as a complement without any added extra cost. I understand that 50% of the viewers are viewing this webinar who have not been part of Yen Nutrition last year. So for the benefit, I'll quickly run through the whole process. You can order a Yen Nutrition package or a membership directly from the Yen website, or via the bulk order route, where you can ask the bulk order liaison person to help you with a membership. And this is done between me, the grower, and the bulk order liaison person. Generally, the bulk order liaison person is the person who is buying the IDs in bulk, that is 10 or more membership. So these are the key organizations or the agronomists who buy bulk order from us, and then we'll be able to pass it on to you and also manage the account for you. Once you have the membership ID, you'll be asked to fill out the field details form, share the information about your field. That will help us to generate a special code for you. The special code is shared with the labs, and labs will then send the kits out for you to send the relevant field samples back. So please do take the samples, send it back to the lab. The samples get analyzed, and we receive the data, followed by us doing all the analysis and helping you with an online report. Hopefully this year we will be continuing to provide a report via email, but slowly we will be asking you to check your report online using your online account. Just like last year, we are sticking to £250 plus VAT as a cost, so there is no cost increase for this year. And bulk order registration is ongoing. It has just started. And if you want to buy directly from our website, we are hoping to make this available from some point in mid-May. So yeah, if you have any other questions regarding your order or at any part of any part of the process, then please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan and Dhaval. Roger, do you want to join us back? Okay, so there's lots of really interesting questions coming in and have come in from earlier. So I'm going to kick off with a couple linked to nitrogen, really. So Mike Hamley's asked, is the imprecision on nitrogen a result of hindsight? How can we be sure we get it right in the season without knowing weather patterns?
You can't be sure. I am, but yeah, I got my microphone on. Yeah, good. You can't be sure. This is the name of the game in farming. I mean, but the crucial thing is that you don't, I mean, I have a slide which we haven't used, which is about veering off course. But because you can't see nutrients, if you don't monitor what you're doing, it can get worse and worse and worse every year, and you don't know about it. So we're not saying that you will do your post-mortem and know exactly what to do next year. Clearly the weather next year will be different from the weather this year. So it's about not veering off course. And it seems to me, just looking at the data that we've got, that there are farms that are overly generous with nutrients generally, and there are other farms that are overly stingy with nutrients generally. I mean, it may be turned on its head next year, I don't know, but it looks to me like that is the case. And it's, I mean, it's certainly the case with yields, that we've got that sort of pattern happening with yields in the ends over the years. So I rather suspect that it's going to be happening with nutrition as well.
And kind of a bit linked to that, so do you think the inefficiencies in nitrogen, is there scope for minimising those through precision application techniques? So Julian Gold's asking about the use of NDVI or LAI images, or is it more complicated than that? So I guess the question is, how much extra can precision technologies bring to this and improve those inefficiencies?
I mean, I'm an optimist, and I hope we, at the moment, our efficiency of using nitrogen is hugely variable and not brilliant. I mean, it's a lot better than phosphorus, but it's it's on average 60% of what we apply gets into our crops, so 40% doesn't. So that's whereas. I mean, the 40% doesn't always go into the environment. The 40% replaces some nitrogen that you get free from the soil. So overall, we're applying roughly the same amount of nitrogen that we're taking off. But, there are lots of opportunities in what we're doing to improve what we're doing. I'm sure Dan's got lots of things he can add about NDVI, and I mean, we've looked at this quite hard, and
I mean, I think there's two things there with NDVI in terms of the improve our intelligence. One is, going back to Mike's point of can it help us know intelligence on the season, but the question is, well, what do you do about it in a year like this? We know that maybe the crops haven't taken that much up, but does that mean that we should be saying, well, actually yield potential is therefore already down a bit, so we should be putting less on, or does it mean that we have to catch up more, so we should be putting more on? And I think there's all sorts of questions like that which we still don't really always have the perfect answer to. And yeah, we know that there can be a lot of spatial variation, and NDVI can be useful for picking that up. But it's a challenge to really show the benefit when we've done trials on that.
Yeah, we had a question asking about kind of the resolution of the samples and the data that we're collecting. So obviously most people are sending one grain sample that represents a whole field, and just asking about the variation that may be seen in results if more samples were taken and there was data for kind of multiple samples from a field perspective. I think one thing to say is that actually people could do that, couldn't they? They could, zone a field and take multiple grain samples from different zones if they have a particularly variable field, but generally people have sent one sample per field.
Well, and what I always say and think is that it's only sensible to measure the units that you're managing. So if you're a policy advisor and you're managing the country as a whole, maybe you should just measure the country as a whole. But if you're managing your whole farm as one unit, then you only need to analyze one sample as long as it represents the whole farm, but most people manage by fields, so it's sensible to sample the field, but make sure that that sample is representative. And the brilliant thing about grain analysis or grain sampling is it's so much better than leaf sampling or soil sampling. Soil sampling, you have to walk your W across the field, and you're walking across all sorts of variation, whereas the combine and the trailers mix all the grain up rather nicely for us, and as long as we take a couple of handfuls from every trailer, that's pretty, there was a lot of work done on grain sampling. That's pretty darn representative of the field as a whole. So it's an accurate way of representing a field. If you're managing zones within fields, then the sensible thing is to measure the zones separately. But if you can afford to do that, that's the question.
I'd also just add that there's quite a lot of people in the data from last year and in the ends where we've where people have taken the same samples from the same field, 2 or more, and largely in the context of trials, so reviewing tramline trials and seeing whether there's an effect on yield or nutrient net. And one of the nice things, one of the things that's just taken me a lot of time over the last 6 months in putting the database together is that we're now consistent with every field. So that where we've had the same field multiple times through the yen over the last 8 years, we should, fingers crossed, have it assigned correctly. And that's one of the things that when we're going forward with this, when the reasons for why you need to log in to the website is that you will then select your field or add your field, and then we'll know that field. So if you're using the same, if you're putting multiple entries in on the same field, then we can start to get at that question. So we could actually get at that question now. It'll be a little bit confounded by that. Most of the time, there's been treatment differences in there as well, but we can start to get a bit of a handle on that within field variation.
Okay.
And also just to say, when I've done this in the past with grain protein content, looking at variation in grain protein content, what we've tended to see is that the variation in grain protein content is much less spatially than it is with grain yield.
We've got a couple of questions about yield dilution, which I think we were maybe preempting. So a question about what's the impact of final grain yield on grain nutrient concentrations, and there was another question about do we see kind of reduced concentrations with higher yields?
So I mean, I think that this is an important thing, and Roger alluded to it earlier, and because there is a relationship in the data set, with grain protein content that we all know high yielding crops tend to have lower protein content. So that kind of relationship goes in in the opposite direction to there kind of being a straight direct relationship between as a deficiency, if you like. And I think that we should be exploring the sort of thing that Roger talked about, where we look at the relationship of the nutrients to other nutrients, and to try and kind of try and kind of discount that dilution effect. So that's something we can do.
But I also think that that we would, when we do experiments, we always see this. If you do an experiment growing different varieties, you give all the varieties the same amount of nitrogen. The higher yielding varieties have the lower protein, and that's bound to be the case. But when we're talking about field to field variation, it seems to me that as we see high yields having low protein, it probably means that that crop would have benefited from having a bit more nitrogen. I mean, it particularly if the nitrogen concentration dips well below 2%, or in other words, 10.8% protein. So for a feed variety, so or whatever the recommended list level is. So as if your protein is going down because of yield dilution, it probably means that crop merits more nitrogen, and vice versa. So if you're getting regularly 15% protein in your grain, you're using too much nitrogen. even if and your crop is only 6 tons per hectare, you're using too much nitrogen.
Another interesting question, and I think hopefully in asking this, David is getting at what hopefully we think the power of sharing data and the approach from DN is. He's asked, will it be possible to update critical levels of nutrients and particularly micronutrients using YEN data? Currently, there's a wide range of recommendations that are not particularly helpful.
Yes, I mean, that's a really good question, and the answer isn't terribly pleasing probably to David, because we need to do experiments. If we're going to improve our knowledge about critical levels, we will need to do experiments. I have an ambition, and we have several groups who have been involved in nutrition and who want to form nutrition clubs who actually do experiments. And my thoughts are about leaving, we spray a lot of nutrients, we spread a lot of nutrients, and if we could get in the if it could make it relatively easy to leave patches that where we've missed a nutrient, and then we can drive the combine with its monitor through that patch and measure the difference in yield as a result of that. When we start getting yield differences and where we get the grain concentrations, then we'll have better knowledge about the critical values. But I'm afraid it does depend on doing experiments.
Yeah, we've had lots of questions from Thomas Pearson, but one which I think is quite interesting and gives us an opportunity to talk about what we hope YEN Nutrition will actually do is, what are the key overall outcomes that we are looking for in YEN Nutrition?
What are the key?
What do we hope that YEN Nutrition can achieve, and why do we want people to come on this journey with us?
We want to use nutrients more responsibly, more efficiently, and more profitably, and that has to be the outcome, I would have said. So the question is all about how you turn these seas of data that Dan has brilliantly amassed into knowledge and valuable predictive knowledge about that will help us make better decisions in the future. So the question is about all agricultural research. Why do we do it? If it's agricultural, it has to be for the benefit of agriculture. Yeah, Dan, you go. I'm sure you've got lots.
Well, I was just going to come back to what you said before about actually really what we need to do to close the loop with this is experimentation. So what we're doing with the data and what we can do, with all the ideas, things that you guys have, is is think of questions, but we can test those. And what we can do now, with tramline trials, with precision farming, with yield mapping, satellite imagery, we can do coordinated, robust trials, across 10, 20, 100 farms, and really then start to get that information, like Roger said, of actually, but where in what are seemingly deficient situations, is there anything I can do about it? Is applying that nutrient actually making a difference to yield or to the nutrient concentration itself? Because that's how we're really going to learn. And the farm pet idea I talked about, really about trying to join up this whole circle of where we can go from the understanding and the ideas through the data, through to the questions, and through the tests, and then back to improved knowledge that we can, we can share with the community.
This annual review that we've written, 30 or 40 pages, it is a very, very preliminary sort of exercise in trying to return you the knowledge that you're generating by sharing your data. And we've probably written it in a very nerdy way that isn't very helpful to you. We've tried to distill it into 4 pages of headlines, if that's what you prefer, but there may be better ways of us sort of gleaning the wisdom that we can get out of the data and return it to you and the rest of the industry, so that we can make progress together, because it's a fiendishly complicated industry, and we've sort of, everybody's ideas have value, and somehow we have to have a way, and that Farm PEP is the dream of you know, having a place where we can share those ideas, share the data. You know, they'll be robust, or at least they'll be vetted by each of us, and you know, we'll move our knowledge front forward.
And kind of a bit linked to the point about experimentation. So we'd had a question about grain analysis results from different fields where the nutrition programme had been quite different. So some fields had received a kind of full nutrition programme and the others not so. But the fact that actually the results didn't highlight any differences. And I guess, yeah, it's thinking about how we use that information then to kind of move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that feeds into an analysis where, you know, the factors that were different between those fields and the grain analysis wasn't different, it'll reduce our confidence that those factors are affecting nutrition. So, you know, you can infer that at the farm level, at the individual farm level, but you can infer it at, you know, the scientist with the big data set level as well. So, yeah, you know, the thing that set us off on this road, I mean, of trying to get data that's actually on farm, you know, real farm data. The nutrients we're measuring in these grains are actually what you are harvesting in kilograms per hectare, and we can do it for all 12 of the nutrients. And in fact, we have a dream of you each having a balance sheet for each field. These are the nutrients that you know you are budgeting to get into your crop. So it's your expected yield times the minimum nutrient concentrations, and these are the nutrients that you're expecting to get from your soils, and these are the nutrients that you applied, and this is the result at the end. And we've gone through that whole exercise with a monitor farmer in well, a monitor farm, didn't we, Sarah? And it really worked well, and we could do it for, you know, right across all the nutrients, and there was quite a lot of learning in that process. Yeah, so I think we can take things forward fairly fast at the beginning.
We also had a couple of interesting questions about kind of the use of what we're doing in the context of human nutrition, and also we had a question about selenium is important in livestock production, and do we have any data for concentrations in the grain? So I suppose there are also possible bigger implications, aren't there, that we're doing. We're very interested in it from a production perspective and improving nutrition, but actually the knowledge and the understanding that we gain could have implications in other sectors, and I suppose on a global perspective from a human nutrition point of view.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, the yen has been almost entirely industry funded. I mean, Dan's got this little bit of innovate money to help us develop the data processing, but and if we're going to address, you know, we don't measure selenium in the grain at the moment. We could. It wouldn't cost. I'm not sure it would even cost anything other than a bit of extra hassle for Dhaval, but it would, you know, but what we would really need is a group that was interested in understanding selenium, and ideally a component, as you know, somebody in the industry would need to put their hand in their pocket and say, yeah, let's study selenium as it's being harvested in crops across the UK at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, it's 25 past and there's another poll to do, so I think we'll probably finish there with the questions. So thank you for answering all of those so comprehensively. So if we can move to the next slide now, if possible. Well, and Jane, if you can, we've done that bit. If you can launch the final poll, please, Jane. Okay, so we're really interested to kind of see what you think the use of Yen Nutrition is. So the question is, what do you see as the most useful aspect of Yen Nutrition? So the offtake report and individual results, the benchmarking report and comparing results to others, the insights that are being provided through the analysis of the data, or all of the above, or other. So I'll just wait a couple of seconds for people to finish voting. Okay, so if you'd like to share the results, please, Jane. Okay, so the vast majority, 63% of you, think that all three possible options are of real value. And it is interesting to see that actually the minority is that it's the offtake report and individual results. So many seem to see the benefit of sharing data and putting data together through benchmarking, and also that the analysis of the data is an important part of Yen Nutrition. And I think from our perspective, definitely that comprehensive analysis of the data is where there's a lot of value in terms of being able to improve our learning and our understanding. So it just leaves me really to once again thank all the Yen sponsors who have continued to support this initiative from its starting back in 2012, and we hope that if you're interested in Yen Nutrition that you will join this year, and hopefully you'll hear about when you can register on the Yen website to do so, or speak with your contact if you've done Yen Nutrition through the bulk order path. And I think on that note, it just leaves me to thank everyone for joining, and thank you all for your questions and comments. There's some that we haven't got to today, so it's good kind of food for thought in terms of our future thinking and seeing what people are particularly interested in as well. So on that note, we'll finish up. Thank you.